Welcome to the show. Today we're talking about sex addiction, alcohol addiction, in fact, addiction or addictions in general. Our guest today has been a wonderful friend of mine for many years. His name is Dom Quartuccio, and he is the leader of the Great Man Within community, of the Great Man Within podcast. He has a series of masterminds of men who are working together to become their best selves. And Dom grew up in New Jersey. He doesn't drink today. And he's done a tremendous amount of inner work on himself and has inspired many, many people to do the inner work on themselves and has transformed many folks throughout corporate America, spoken on stages, and inspired people to really live their best lives. And you would think that someone admitting to sex addiction might be kind of painful. And it's certainly, as you'll hear Dom reveal, it certainly was when he first did this, but now he speaks quite candidly about it. And there are many things that we can learn about sex addiction and love addiction and shopping addiction that cross over to alcohol addiction, why we drink. So we're going to dig into this conversation here with Dom. Really fascinating conversation, wonderful guy. And the intention is that we get you, and as happened to me, to get you to really shift your identity, to really think of you having a requirement to be your best self, whether that's getting healthy, whether that's doing inner work, whether that's identifying childhood trauma, whether that's showing up for your family, not just showing up and being there physically present, but showing up being the best version of you. So wonderful conversation. I'm about to hit play on it. Here is Dom Quartuccio. What was life growing up in Jersey in relation to the drinking culture there, Dom?
Oh, man. So in high school, actually, I think I started drinking my freshman year of high school was kind of where everyone that I knew started drinking, and it became kind of a part of the fabric of our lives. Wasn't really even questioned. It was, if you wanted to fit in, if you wanted to go to the parties, you would drink. So 14 years old, 15 years old, however old you are as a freshman in high school.
Yeah. And how did that continue for you and until when?
Yeah. I mean, go to college. I was in a fraternity. So, clearly in fraternity, you're drinking, you're trying to drink as much as possible. And I remember my fraternity was particularly the heaviest drinkers on campus. And yeah, it's kind of it was a sign of masculinity, how much you could drink. And, we made these beer funnels so you could drink 2 beers at a time and under 10 seconds. We had, as part of my pledging class, we were stuck in a basement. They had a keg and they turned it on, and they said that we weren't allowed to turn the keg off and not a drop of beer was allowed to hit the ground. So we all had to drink like as much as we could, until the keg was empty.
Yeah.
It's just stuff like that. And that just continued on and on and on.
Yeah. I remember when I played rugby for Los Angeles Rugby Club in the mid 2000s, sort of 2003 through 2006, I think. And if I was quote unquote lucky enough to win the man of the match, the best player of the match, then the reward was going back to this famous pub in Manhattan Beach, California called Sharky's, where I had to scull or chug, whatever word you want to use, like half a pitcher or a pitcher of beer as my teammates would scream around me going, chug, 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 skull, skull, skull.
Yep.
And then I hated that. So it almost was an incentive not to play well each Saturday.
Yeah. I get it, man. I mean, there's some people who seem to be more comfortable when they're drinking, and become like better, maybe funnier, maybe more bold. That never really worked. That happened for me. Maybe I got a little bit more easygoing, but it actually, alcohol oftentimes brought out my dark side. And I'm a pretty loving guy. I'm pretty compassionate, patient. I'm put together, when I'm in my sober state. But I had this dark side of me that my friends affectionately termed angry Dom. And, like these were my high school, like guys that I grew up with. They were the ones that all of that frustration, resentment, things that I couldn't speak up for when I was sober, that stuff, once the alcohol was in my system, would come out. And I'd be particularly cutting of my friends. I would antagonize. I would do some really stupid stuff and pick on the guys who were much bigger than me, and just to get them riled up, and then I'd get my ass kicked. So there was that whole other world of myself that came out when the governor came off.
Yeah. How long did that last until, what was the catalyst for you stopping, and what were the circumstances around that?
Stopping drinking. Well, so that angry Dom behavior continued into my mid 20s. And I'll never forget it. Like the day that I had to confront that was when I totally, I wrecked an entire day that we affectionately termed as a group of guys called Man Day. Okay. So we were in our late 20s. This was around the time that a lot of the guys were starting to partner up and get married. And, our group was just starting to drift, kind of how that happens.
Yes.
And so once a year, we would do this thing called Man Day, where we would come over to my place. I lived in Hoboken, New Jersey, with a couple of other guys, and it was men only. We had all these rules, like you couldn't drink, you couldn't eat anything like healthy, so you couldn't have any salads. Like you had to eat fried foods and pizzas, and we would only drink Miller High Life and play drinking games all day long. And I got really drunk. And this was a thing that we looked forward to every year. I got really drunk. I started antagonizing this one guy who was much bigger than I am. And I got him so upset that he ended up breaking a lamp. He pile drived me into the floor. The guys had to pull each other off, and it ruined the party. And that was the first time that a lot of the men in the group were just like, dude, you're not cool. Like you ruined this for us. And I remember having a lot of guilt and shame around that. I'd never had that experience before. And I think that was the first time, Swanee, that I really started looking at my drinking behaviors and thinking, maybe I got to do something about this.
It's funny, not funny, but interesting that you say that there was something from within you that was driving this behavior, and maybe the alcohol was just the gasoline on the fire. And for someone else who's listening here, it might be a married woman who deliberately picks a fight with her husband, or it might be a husband who is not present with their kids, or they deliberately try to create friction in their marriage. And then they blame the alcohol. Oh, it's the alcohol. But there's something that's actually driving that behavior from within initially. Did you ever come to figure out what was driving that behavior in the first place?
It took me a while to figure out what that was. And I know we're getting to a different part of my story later, so I won't jump the gun on that one. But at the time, I blamed alcohol, like a lot of people do. It's kind of like, oh, when alcohol's in my system, then I become that guy. But what I started to recognize upon reflection, and I didn't know what to do with this, but this insight of, there are a lot of times in my normal sober life where someone will say something to piss me off. And instead of addressing it, I'll just eat that. And then I'll push it down and I'll be upset at myself, or I'll be upset at that person. There were a lot of feelings of inferiority around, watching these other guys in my life who were able to go and get the woman that they wanted, and I couldn't. I remember feeling insecure and not being able to speak up for myself. And so there were a lot of these little things that I started to see, that when I got drunk, then the anger that I accumulated started coming out in those ways. And I was like, okay, there is something deeper inside here that I'm not dealing with. But at that time, it was just an awareness, and I had no idea what to do with it.
Yeah. Because the easy thing is to blame the alcohol, because that's outside of ourselves.
Yep.
Isn't it? As opposed to going within and saying, maybe my mummy didn't love me enough, or loved me too much. Maybe my dad said something to me when I was 6 years old and I meant it mean something. Maybe someone in the sandpitter in the schoolyard when I was 7 said something and I let it mean something. A lot of these factors, and there's a lot of science or study behind this that seems to suggest that by the time we're 7 or 8 years old, our entire worldview is pretty much formed.
Right.
Which I find fascinating, isn't it? That you're going to see life through the lens of what you perceive it to be at the age of 7 or 8, and you can really only make marginal shifts after the age of 8. That's fascinating to me. And imagine 4 billion human beings on the planet all seeing life the way that they saw it, and determined by what happened before the age of 8. Have you ever thought of that? Have you ever kind of gone back and had a look and gone, why am I the way I am?
Oh my gosh, it's kind of what I do for a living, and I do this for all the men that are in our communities of inner work. And it's a bit unfair if you think about it, because before the age of 7, you don't really have much agency. You don't have any real agency about how you're living your life. You kind of get birthed into this world, and then the circumstances are set of which you're birthed into. You didn't choose to be born in Australia. I didn't choose to be born in New Jersey. To the parents I was born to, the circumstances. But I got to say, all things considered, I hit the lottery. But even then, I still grew up and had my own wounds. And here's a great example of this. Up until I started doing therapy, coaching for myself, I thought that I grew up in like the perfect environment, and the perfect parental household. I thought that everything was perfect, like Norman Rockwell painting type stuff. And so these questions that you ask about when mom said something when I was a kid, or when that thing happened in school as a 7-year-old, I made it mean that, like, that wasn't even a framework I just thought that everything was perfect about my childhood. But then when I started to look at some of my behaviors, whether it was angry Dom when I was, drunk, or some of this other stuff we're going to talk about, I could start to see the seeds of, oh my God, that imprint that happened when I was 7 or when I was 12 is the thing that now is destroying me at 33 and burning down the world around me when I'm 33. And so going back in time travel is essential to understanding who you've become.
You do a lot of men's work now. In fact, you have some amazing work that you do. You're the leader of the Great Man Within community, which is a series of masterminds of men working to become their best self.
Yep.
And as we're recording this, you're wearing a pretty cool shirt that says the Great Man Within.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about that, and what are some of what's the pattern of issues that come up for men specifically?
Oh man. Yeah. So there was this quote I saw a while ago that I haven't been able to attribute the source, but it was a quote around the definition of hell. And the definition of hell is that on your last day on earth, the person that you became meets the person you could have become. So on your last day on earth, the person you became meets the person you could have become. And what that's saying is that the person you became was kind of like this safe, predictable, don't rock the boat, status quo kind of person. But then you see this flash, this image of the person you could have become, which is who you are at your fullest potential. Like who you are when you found your purpose, like who you were if you decided to live a little bit of a life of risk and live out over your edge. And that fear of, or that idea of taking your last breath and seeing your potential, but never having lived it, that was something that really sent like a fear chill down my spine. And very shortly thereafter, I ended up having this vision of who is that person in my life, that full potential version of me. And it was like this great man within. And I think that we all have that, like men, women, we all have that great version of ourselves that if we have the courage to live, like we can live into that person. And so when, we as the men in our communities, like these masterminds, it's groups of say 20 men, 25, 30 men who get together every week virtually, and we work on different aspects of ourselves. And a number of these guys have been through your program of Project 90, like they've graduated. Evan and Enderpaul, I know that one or maybe both of them have been on your podcast, and they're phenomenal guys. When they discovered what they were like after alcohol, they started to ask themselves the question, like, what else is in here? Oh my God, I'm seeing the world with such clarity. I'm making more money. I'm more vibrant and vital. Life seems to have an extra sparkle. What else am I capable of? And so that's the kind of question that we're answering inside of our community is like, what are you capable of? Let's figure it out.
Yeah, amazing. And Evan and Interpol don't mind us sharing their name because they've been interviewed on the podcast and they've spoken publicly about it. So yeah, they graduated Project 90, got drinking out of their system, and then continued their self-development work and leaning into your program, The Great Man Within, which is amazing. You spoke, well, actually, before we just hit record on this and we started the conversation, I was asking you what you felt comfortable sharing on this episode and what you didn't. And you've been quite candid in sharing about your sex addiction. And so I would just invite you just to share a little bit about that in the context of, let's see what we can learn about that as it relates to addiction in general, because a lot of people who are listening to this podcast are obviously trying to have a better relationship with alcohol. But I'm sure if, any addiction, there are similarities there on what triggers this type of behavior. So speak freely, share with us your story around that.
Cool. And I hope that this is useful for your audience, because one of the things that I learned when I went into Sex Addicts Anonymous, and this was 10 years ago, 2013 to 2017, I spent in Sex Addicts Anonymous recovery. So that is a 12-step program, and it's based on the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. One of the things that I found out was 80% of people with an addiction have multiple addictions. I was one of the 20% who only had one addiction. And this was a study that, Alcoholics Anonymous had shared. So you can check the facts on that, but had multiple addictions. So what I found was there were a lot of people who were in sex addicts who had also alcohol. There were alcoholics. Some of them were in Debtors Anonymous, like had insane amounts of debt, or Narcotics Anonymous, you name it. So you're right, Swanee, like there's something kind of at the core inside a system that hasn't been dealt with that then manifests in these different types of addictions. So one of the things that I would love for your audience to hear is my story around the making of a sex addict. Like how does one, kind of come to this place where there's this type of addiction? And I think a lot of your listeners may be able to relate on a number of levels, whether it's with problematic drinking or even around their sexuality. So I grew up in a very religious household, or let's put it this way. I went to 7 years of Catholic schooling. I was an altar boy, youth group, and 7 years at St. Paul's school in Ramsey, New Jersey, where I was taught that sex was sinful, like you're going to hell. Do it when you get married, but that's it. I was also raised by two beautiful, loving parents who are incredible human beings, where sexuality was the single most terrifying subject for them to approach. Like when I was a kid and we would watch movies on a Friday night together, if there was a PG movie where a woman's shirt came off, my parents would lunge across the couch and be like, no, and try to cover my eyes. And the collective sphincter of the room would tighten and it would just get really dark. So my body was feeling like, I want to see that. Like my body was screaming for more of that. But then everywhere I went, it was like, this is wrong. This is evil. This is sinful. And I'll share one little story about kind of like an escalation. Then I'll pause, see where you want to jump on this, Swanee. But I remember being 14 years old. And in my household, my parents were vigilant around what I could watch and what I couldn't watch. I wasn't allowed to watch MTV, because it was too salacious. And rated R movies, forget it. I had to go to my best friend's house to watch that stuff. But one day my parents slipped up and they left me unaccompanied with a rated R movie known as White Men Can't Jump. Right? Woody Harrelson and Wesley Snipes.
Wesley Snipes, yeah.
But God bless her, Rosie Perez.
Oh yeah, Rosie Perez, yeah. Yeah.
So there's this scene in the movie, and I pop in the movie. I'm alone at home by myself, like this never happens. And I got the movie in the VCR. So I'm 43 years old, just to kind of give people a sense of where we are with VCRs and everything.
You're 43 years old now. You're not 43 years old then. Yeah.
Correct. It's 14 then. I was 43 now.
Yeah.
And there's this sex scene with Rosie, and I'm fired up, and I get turned on and I'm watching this. I rewind, I play, I rewind, I play. I'm rubbing myself and through my blue sweatpants. I don't know what I'm doing. It just feels good. And then all of a sudden, this force of energy comes thundering through my body like a fire truck down Broadway, New York City here. And all of a sudden it's just like bang, bang, like these supernova explosions in my mind. I blacked out for a second. And then when I came to, my pants were wet and I was like, what the hell just happened? And what I discovered there was my body could do something that felt like pulling on heroin at any point in time. And the immediate next reaction I had around that was, after saying this was amazing, the immediate next reaction was, I just did something really wrong. So it created kind of this world of a secret self. And I think this is the concept I want to pause on here, because I know I've just been going on a monologue, but I developed this secret self. I think we all have three kinds of selves: the public self that we show to the world, the private self that has some discernment around, Swanee, you get to know things about me that others don't because we have a relationship. You do that with your parents or your best friends, your partner. But then there's that secret self, that third part of you that you bury all of the stuff that you're ashamed of, right? That you think that no one's going to love, or your family's taught told you that it's wrong, or maybe it's not masculine, or maybe it's not feminine, whatever those things are. And for me, it was my sexuality that I became deathly afraid anyone would find out about. And I buried that for 20 years.
Buried it for 20 years. Well, that wouldn't have had any effect on you.
No, not at all.
So the next question is, what impact did that create in your life? From this happened when you were 14, let's say 20 years, 34. What was the impact?
Defined my whole life in so many ways. And I didn't realize that. So what my sexual outlet came to be for me was, I was a hypersensitive kid. I felt a lot of things. So whenever I'd be insecure, lonely, bored, overwhelmed, stressed, you name it, I would jerk off. Like that became my thing to medicate. And then as I got older, then it was about like conquest with girls my age, or then it became women. And all of the while that was happening as a secret. No one knew about this stuff. I didn't talk to anyone about it. It felt alive, and it felt this aliveness. It felt this excitement anytime there was a new woman who entered my life, or a new thing that I could fantasize about. But every time that came with a sense of guilt and shame, like I'm perverted, there's something wrong with me, I'm broken, I'm weird. And as a result of that, and by the way, I had no awareness of any of this stuff at the time. I had to do this in my recovery. But at the time, what that did was it created this massive barrier to intimacy. Because how could I ever allow anyone to see the full me? I'm disgusting, right? Like I have this thing that, like, who would want to see it? Completely unaware that that's what I was doing. So anytime someone would get close to me, I would kind of project this image of who I was. When they'd get too close, I'd get nervous, and I'd do something to either push them away, or I'd look for some fault in them, to push them away. And it was after 20 years where finally, for the first time in my life, I fell in love with a woman. She penetrated and pierced that armor. And it was simultaneously the most beautiful and most terrifying experience of my life, because she'd gotten in so close. And I finally got to experience what love felt like. I'd heard people sing songs about love. I'd watched movies about love, but I never personally experienced it. I thought I was defective. But I felt that with her. And at the same time, equally terrified that the closer she got, she was going to find out what was really in here. And that's exactly what happened. I sabotaged the relationship by stepping out on her, which I never thought I would do. And to save the relationship, back in 2013, like the very beginning of the year, I entered Sex Addicts Anonymous to heal that relationship, and eventually figuring out it was less about the relationship and more about healing all the stuff that was in here.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Dom. Because I realize it's not, I know you've spoken about this a lot now, but it's also, I just want to acknowledge you for revealing so much of at one stage was your private life, right? Because this is not something, it's not common for people to go into such detail and depth about their private lives. So thank you for sharing in the interest of supporting my community here.
And Swan, if I can just make one distinction there, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I do want to make a proper distinction between private life and secret life. A private life, we all need to have private lives, right? Like there's certain parts of your private life that people who you trust, who you care about, get to hear certain parts of you, see parts of you that the rest of the world doesn't. And your private life is defined by discernment, right? Discernment of who gets to see you and who doesn't. But the secret life, this is something I think that everyone needs to know about, addict or not, because everyone has a secret life. Everyone has, and you're only as sick as your secrets. Like we hear that all the time in the 12-step program. And the secret life is categorized by shame, right? Private life is discernment. Secret life is shame. And the parts of you that you stuff away in this shameful corner of your life are the things that will drive you to drink or gamble, drugs, or workaholism, or in my case, sex addiction.
So if we take this and we look at many of our listeners here who struggle with alcohol, is alcohol numbing the secret shame that they're holding, or that we're holding?
Absolutely. And I think that whatever our numbing mechanisms are, it's to avoid the discomfort, the feelings that are inside that we don't have the tools to deal with just yet. That's why your program is so important, right? I mean, you get people in the space who don't have the tools to navigate those emotions. And when they come off alcohol, you give them the framework, you give them the support, the tools to deal with that. We're all dealing with, let's say, there's a litany of things that we're dealing with. Imposter syndrome, or maybe I said something to my partner and spouse that I can't take back, and I'm ashamed of that. I'm going to drink that out. I'm not where I should be in life. I'm going to drink that out. My body doesn't look the way I want it to. I'm going to drink that out. I mean, you name whatever, pick your poison is. I'm not a good husband. I'm not a good father. I'm not whatever. Pick your poison. Yes, the shame that accumulates from that, we look for our favorite narcotic or for our favorite drink to numb that out.
Yeah. And that shame, does that come from nature or nurture, do you think? Do you think that we're inherently built with this shame, or do you think it's a cumulative effect of all of the things that have happened in our life, how we were raised, our culture, circumstance?
Shame has to be 100% nurture. Because if you look at animals, there is no such thing as shame in animals. You think about that, right? I mean, shame is a social construct. It's based on things that we've created around right and wrong. And you do need certain levels of right and wrong if you're going to live in a complex society and humanity as we engage with each other. There need to be certain rules. But if you think about what caused my shame, there was, and this was just my experience. There's a lot of people who are deeply religious who haven't had this kind of upbringing, but my upbringing was in my faith, and then also in my home by my parents. Like, sexuality was something to be feared, something that was shameful, something that was, sinful. Who says, right? Like, the people who said, or the institutions that said, took this very natural feeling inside of me that we all have and turned it into something that I had to hide, or I felt like I had to hide. But the same feelings that I felt, some other kid felt who was maybe in a sex positive household, got the conversation from the parents. It's like, okay, here's what that is. Here's how we talk about that. Here's the age where you might consider wanting to, be mature enough to use that. And had an entirely different experience where there's no shame around sexuality around that. So yeah, I think shame is 100% a nurture thing.
And so things like alcohol or food addiction or porn or shopping or love addiction, any addiction is really a way of numbing out the shame that we have nurtured in ourselves over the years since childhood.
I think it's one reason, I think it's one reason of numbing out shame. But like for me, it didn't start that way. It started as, at first it felt awesome. Like it just, the like learning what my body did, it felt amazing. And then I was like, oh, but I can also use this when I start to feel anxious and I start to feel nervous or I start to feel insecure. I can get that energy out of me when I release. And it's like, oh, okay, now I'm kind of numb. A lot of men do this now. Life is overwhelming, crying kids, work, partner. I'm going to go to the bathroom for a little bit, put on Pornhub, and then, release, and now I can go back out and deal with it. Guys will do that. So, but you do that a few times, and then there starts to accumulate some shame around, man, I'm running off to the bathroom. I'm doing that. I don't have the energy I need to meet, like when it's time to have sex with my husband or my wife, I don't have it anymore. Like that's where the shame starts to accumulate, and then it compounds. And now you need to use the thing, alcohol, eating, sex, to now numb out the shame that came from a very different origin story.
This podcast is sponsored by my eyewear and sleep optimization company, Swanick. If you suffer eye strain from computer use, you find it challenging to focus and concentrate, your sleep is poor, you have low energy, you're tired and sometimes experience anxiety, then it could be because you're staring into screens all day and night. Swanick produces stylish blue light blocking glasses to help you sleep better and generate more energy and focus during the day. A Harvard University and University of Washington published study revealed that Swannies wearers reported sleeping 14% better during the night and were 9% more productive during the day. That's huge. Swannies are currently worn as a sleep and performance aid by professional athletes at teams including the Dallas Cowboys, New York Knicks, Manchester United, and many more. They've been featured on media including The Dr. Oz Show, Live with Kelly and Ryan, and The New York Times. I personally designed Swannies back in 2015, and they've now helped almost 200,000 people sleep and perform better. And because you're a listener of the Alcohol-Free Lifestyle podcast, you can now get your pair and enjoy 15% off. To get the best blue light blocking glasses on the market, go to swannies.com and enter code JAMES at checkout for 15% off. That's swannies.com and enter code JAMES at checkout for 15% off. Did you figure all of this out inside of your sex addiction group? It was Sex and Love Addiction Anonymous, right?
So there's actually two separate programs, Sex Addicts Anonymous and then Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous happens to have like a lot of men and women. Sex Addicts Anonymous is typically 100% men. And that was the group I was in, mostly like sex related stuff versus love and codependency in the other program. And what was your original question about that?
Is this where you unpacked a lot of this stuff? Is this where you kind of got a better idea of who you are and why you do the things you do? And is this where you did you resolve these issues inside of those programs, or was that the catalyst and the starting point, and it was a combination of that plus many other things over the years that have supported you?
Yeah, great question. So I spent 4 years in Sex Addicts Anonymous, 2013, 2017. I'd say 70% of my recovery came from being in that program, from having a sponsor who was kick-ass that like helped me work through all the steps. I had therapy, I had group therapy, and I had a coach, John O'Connor, right? You know John O'Connor, a mutual friend of ours, near the tail end of that, not at the beginning of that. And so what Sex Addicts Anonymous helped me to do was like to look at and go and give me the tools to go back at my life in early stages of my life and actually see how I formed my relationship with sexuality, how that secret life formed, how I developed all the shame around it, how all of that escalated year by year. All of that came through my work in Sex Addicts Anonymous. I'll be forever grateful in that group. What I ended up finding though, after 2 years of being in Sex Addicts Anonymous, I looked around and I felt like I plateaued. I stopped all my bottom line bad behaviors, but I felt like I plateaued, and I looked around the rooms, meaning like the where we would go to get our help. And I couldn't find anybody that had a life and a relationship with their sexuality that I wanted to emulate. And no one seemed to have a healthy relationship with their sexuality. They just kind of were stopping the bad behaviors and trying to hold on. So I had to leave Sex Addicts Anonymous to find like what was a healthy relationship with sexuality looking like, not just a avoiding your bad behaviors life,
How did you find that? Healthy examples.
So two big things: coaches that worked with me individually, and then communities. So I started, it's ironically, like I don't know if this is ironic or not, but one of my best friends, Brian Stacy, who's my podcast partner on the Great Man Within podcast, he ran a sexual health company. It's called Beam. And what they did was, anyway, we don't need about the sexual health company, but I got invited to all of these like sexual health events where there was a lot of sex positivity and these groups of people who were talking openly about sexuality and consent and talking about their bodies, and they're talking about their kinks. And that blew me away, man, because I was just in an environment for 4 years, actually for maybe 34 years, where you weren't allowed to talk about any of that stuff. And then 4 years in Sex Addicts Anonymous, where you weren't really at all allowed to talk about those things because it could trigger someone else. So it was such a refreshing environment to be in. And this is why you do Project 90, right? Community, when people come together and they can just be swimming in like-minded minds, where everyone's going through something together. When I got into communities of sex positivity, it allowed me to start talking to people who were like, dude, you're not an addict. You're not helpless or powerless. You just had a really raw deal. You were sold some shit growing up, told things that that messed you up. And so I think that was the biggest thing at the end, was finding myself in a community where I could talk about this stuff, be loved for it. That secret life, I'm glad you asked this question. That's where that secret life was finally able to totally dissolve, because I was able to share all of that, not just in my Sex Addicts Anonymous rooms, but in like my waking life. And that was then what allowed me to speak openly and publicly in my men's groups about sex addiction, and then on the podcast, and then sharing it with everybody. Now I have a secret-free life.
A secret-free life must feel liberating.
It's the ultimate in freedom, Swanee. I mean, I spent my whole life trying to protect and guard, whether I knew it consciously or not. And now the worst parts of my life have been exposed. And people love me for it, because I did the work, and I've made amends. And the reason why people come and listen to the work that I do is because they all have stuff that they're terrified of sharing. And when they can see that someone's successfully done it and is applauded for it and trusted because of it, they're like, maybe then I can get some of that.
Tell me, your parents, are your parents still with us?
They are, yeah.
And so how did you broach this subject with them the first time and then ongoing? Because I'm sure they're aware of what you do, and you've spoken about this publicly. So what was that experience like the first time you broached the subject with them?
It's a beautiful question, by the way. I had two separate conversations, one with my mother, one with my father. My mother, and both of them are just incredible. Like, they're just, in my lowest moments in life, they've always had nothing but unconditional love. So with my mother, when I shared with her how I ended up the way that I did, she felt so responsible in so many ways about creating that environment where, sex was something that I felt scared to talk about and I had to hide it. And she was so apologetic and in the most beautiful of ways. She's like, I'm so sorry. And it created a beautiful bonding moment with us. And my father and I had an even more unbelievable conversation where he revealed some stuff about his life with me that I never expected. That, my father's kind of one of the traditional guys of his generation, keeps that stuff inside. And it was, I would say, one of like the 2 or 3 moments of my life where he shared something that no one else knows about with me. And he was sitting right here. I'm pointing to like the chair. I remember exactly where I was. I was over there. He was there. And I'll never forget it. So that was a beautiful moment for me. And since then, we don't really talk about it. My parents see that it's out there and it's uncomfortable for them. They don't know how to navigate that stuff. And if like friends were to ask about it, it would make them uncomfortable. All I know is that they love me. They love what I'm doing unconditionally, and they don't need to understand the rest. And that's fine with me.
There are some people who don't love you unconditionally, like corporate America.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Because you've shared with me previously that, you were a very accomplished public speaker. You would do the circuit in corporate America, motivational type things, mindset type things. And by all accounts, you had a successful profession, traveling around and being paid handsomely and inspiring people. And then something happened when you went public with this type of content around sex addiction. What happened?
So yes and no, Swanee. This is the fascinating part. So everything you talked about being like the majority of my work, 90% of my income was coming from corporate space. I was terrified to go public about sex addiction, which I did on my podcast because I thought that it would make me unhireable in the corporate space. I was shocked to find out that it didn't. In fact, all of the people who had opened doors for me before had nothing but great things to say. They listened to the podcasts. They loved me. And I continued like my rise inside the corporate space. Like I ended up doubling my speaking fees. Everything was going phenomenally well. And that shocked the hell out of me, how accepting it was. Now, that's not to say there were a few gigs that were canceled, when people say, for example, if there was a committee, hiring me and then they went and did research and maybe there was women on the committee who was like, I'm uncomfortable with bringing a sex addict in, or men on the committee who were like, just, that there could be questions I don't want to answer. So there was some of that. The thing that shut down my corporate career, and this is kind of a funny story. It's known in my community as Porngate. I had two separate email lists in my business. One email list was for the corporate space. The other email list was for all the men's work stuff that I do. And those were church and state, never the two shall meet. Because whenever I would do a podcast episode around sex addiction or around something like pornography, which is a huge issue for so many guys. I mean, we could do a whole 2 hours on pornography, period. I did this podcast on pornography where an email was written about it. And it was talking about how guys could make better decisions around the porn they're using. That email was supposed to only go out to the men's group. That email ended up going out to 300 of my corporate clients. Including the largest women's run organization in financial services that had representatives from like Fidelity, T. Rowe Price and Vanguard and UBS and Morgan Stanley, like all the who's who. And Swanee, that email went out on a Monday. By Friday, I was done. All of my clients were fired. That business was completely ended because they just couldn't, there was no way they could clean up that mess. And that's what was the catalyst for Porngate, was the catalyst for me going 100% into men's work. And I've never looked back.
Amazing. I don't know why I was chuckling as I'm hearing the story, because it's a serious. I'm sorry, it's funny. It was pretty funny.
It's hilarious.
We got to laugh at these things. Yeah,
it's hilarious.
I think Apple came out with this their latest updates a couple of weeks ago, or a week ago, I think it was, where now, if you send a text message and then you regret sending the text message, you've got 15 minutes to actually make it disappear. I'm like, imagine if you could go back to sending that email out to the wrong list. Here's a question for you. Would you, like now knowing what you know, would you say, oh, I'm going to retract that email and just go on? Or are you now happy and thrilled that actually happened?
I love that is a part of my life. I love it. And here's the other thing. For a long time, I'd wanted to go 100% into this work of supporting men. That's like my life's work. I'll be doing it for the rest of my life. It's so clear, but I was scared of making that transition because 90% of my income came from the corporate space. And as the longer I was allowed to like hang on to, that teat, I wasn't going to leave it. And so something catastrophic needed to happen. And the weird thing was, it wasn't even me sending that email. It was the woman who works for me, who's phenomenal. She just by accident put the 300 corporate clients on this one email. It was the weirdest thing. And so it was the thing I needed to rip the Band-Aid off, to go to the direction that I needed to go. And man, when I'm sitting on my deathbed and I'm reflecting on all of the pivotal moments of my life, that's a pretty damn good one, man.
Yeah. Here's a question. Would you ever get to a situation where you would choose to intentionally send an email to the wrong list, to the quote unquote wrong list? Because this was an accidental thing that happened, right?
Yep.
Okay. So would you, at any stage go, you know what? Let me let me test this. Let me send this email, which could just blow up in my face. But this is kind of a feeling that I have to do it. Have you ever had those moments?
Yes. And let me see if I can answer it this way. If I were to go back in time, this is a really tough question, because one of the bad things that happened during Porngate was, there were a lot of people who stuck their neck out on the line for me, knowing about sex addiction, and they brought me in and they brought me into these women's groups, and then they get this email about pornography. It made them look bad, and they had to answer questions. So like, if I had to do it again, it would be really hard for me to do that again for the benefit of me while they had to deal with the shrapnel. So that's the one way of answering the question. So if I knew that this scenario that you now pose, if I knew that sending some email that may cause like something burning down, as long as I knew it was only burning down my stuff, then I would happily take that risk if I felt there's something in my heart that I know I got to share. And then we'll see what the chips may fall. Like, it could be, beloved, or it could burn things down. But if I felt resolute, I'd send it.
Fascinating. I want to ask you a question. A mutual friend of ours, Dan Go, he actually posted this really cool thing on his Instagram the other day, and I borrowed part of it and kind of reworked. It's like a catchy phrase or catchy question, and I put it out on my social media the other day, and it goes like this. Someone boasts or screams out, "I would die for my kids." Like, they're kind of like boasting, or they're like, of course I would die for my kids. I would die for my kids. And then someone says, okay, that's cool, but would you be willing to get healthy for them?
Right.
By stopping drinking, by overcoming your sex addiction, by et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in most cases, the answer is no. And I've been sitting with this the last few days just going, isn't that so interesting? People are willing to die for their children or their partner in some cases, but they're not willing to stop drinking. They're not willing to get a coach. They're not willing to do work that would absolutely benefit their children or their loved one.
Yep.
Anything come up for you when I share that? I don't really have a specific question other than, what do you think about that? What comes up for you?
Had a conversation about this recently with a man I interviewed on my podcast, because he wrote something called "I Would Die for My Wife, but Would I Truly Live for Her?" And what he talked about were all those micro moments every single day of, do I show up for her on these moments every single day? As men, we tend to prioritize these big chivalrous actions, like dying for someone, or, doing that big, show of affection. But then we miss out, like we swing and miss, or don't even show up on all those micro interactions. And what I think it always boils down to is identity. James Clear, who wrote the book Atomic Habits, he says that the single biggest driver of your behaviors is who you believe yourself to be at your root core, right? And so if you want to believe that you're like a great mother or a great father, the identity of "I would die for them," it reinforces that behavior of "I would die for them," reinforces the identity of "I'm a good father, I'm a good mother." But what's happening here is, I'm not willing to get healthy. On some level, they don't see that connection to the identity of being a good father or being a good mother. They're missing that connection. So they're believing that as long as I'm alive and as long as I'm showing up in some physical way, but even though I'm not there emotionally, and maybe I'm not there mentally, I'm not there spiritually, they're not valuing that. It's not hitting that identity chord. I think if we are able to take that conversation around, if you want to be a good father, if you want to be a good mother, that requires being healthy along with wanting to die for them. And if that's the case, then you got to show up with your alcohol habits. You got to show up with how you work out and you eat.
Yeah. How do we get people to shift that? How do we get people to shift into this feeling that it's a requirement to get control of your drinking habits or whatever your bad habits are? It's a requirement to be the best version of you for your family.
So there's two ways that I see people shift. The one way is something is undeniably broken and you can no longer ignore it, right? You hit, like, that's the proverbial rock bottom, or it's getting close to it, right? And so it's like, okay, this isn't working for me. I need something else. That's one way. The other way is you desire something bad enough. And, Napoleon Hill talks about this all the time. The starting point of achievement is desire, building a burning desire for something. So let's take this concept of identity. One of the things that a lot of men in our group struggle with is body image, weight. We have a lot of guys who know how to lose weight, get to their ideal weight, and then they inevitably balloon back up, like 30, 40, 50 pounds. And then they do it again, find another diet, and then they get to that weight and then they balloon back up. What is ultimately at the bottom of that is deep down inside, what they'll say is, even at my ideal weight, my identity is I'm the fat guy. My identity is I will only white knuckle this until some situation in my life will cause me stress. And then I'm going to eat a lot. I'm going to go back to the weight. Like, their identity is that. Your identity is oftentimes an artifact of the past. All the evidence of who you've been in the past, all the things you've tried in the past. The way you change identity truly is you have to look forward. You have to consciously create the man or the woman that you want to become, and then use what Napoleon Hill talks about building a burning desire. Not a desire, but a burning desire, not a nice to have, a must have. I will absolutely make this happen, have. And then you have to show up every day, 1% better, 1% better, evidence of I'm becoming that person.
Yeah. Because there are lots of examples of folks who do these 30-day stop drinking challenges, sober October, dry January. And I acknowledge and applaud the concept because it gives people a glimpse of what it feels like to be alcohol free and to have healthier habits. But what invariably happens is that on day 30, they go back and celebrate and return to the same level of drinking that they had before, which isn't the 1% better each day that you just referenced. It's kind of...
Yeah, your identity hasn't changed. Your identity is, I'm the person that's doing a 30-day experiment to see if I have the willpower, to do this, but I'm still going to go back to drinking. Yeah. Now, if you're going into this, and this is what your program does that I really respect, is you're causing people to shift their identity. I want to live an alcohol-free life. Here's what life after alcohol looks like. And then you bring people in. When the newbies come into your program, I'm giving you a commercial right now. So, and James did not pay me to do this, but I'm just like using it as a really prime example. When Paul and Evan came in, they talk about, here are all the people who have gotten to the other side of that. And now they're living alcohol free. They're showing me what that looks like. And that sounds like something that I want. And so now I'm envisioning, what does my life look like alcohol free? What does my body look like? What does my bank account look like? I want that. I build a burning desire for that. And so every day I'm going to do something that's in alignment with that. I'm going to change who I hang out with so that I can make that possible. The identity is the thing that needs to shift in order for any sustained behavior to change.
Well, you're certainly doing amazing work, Dom, and getting the identity to shift for a lot of the men, or for all of the men who are coming into your Great Man Within program. Tell us a little bit about where we can find you, about the podcast and about the website where some of our men can reach out to you.
Great. I would first encourage you to check out the Great Man Within podcast. Like, if you liked what you heard here today, all of everything we talk about here in much greater detail on the podcast. So you can type in Great Man Within. You could type in Great Man Within porn, Great Man Within sex addiction, Great Man Within women, and you'll hear like a bunch of episodes around those topics. Instagram, I post daily content around what living life like your great man would look like. And it's really started to take off. So Dominick Q, and Swanee, maybe you can just put that in the show notes, or like at least my name. So Dominick Q on Instagram, and on Instagram have access to all like my website and all the mastermind stuff that you can go and dig deeper on if you're feeling called.
Dom, thank you so much for sharing your story and for giving us your guidance and your expertise. This has been a wonderful conversation. I so appreciate you as always.
Thanks, Swan. It's always a blast with you, man. Great questions.
Here are 5 ways I can support you on your health journey. Number 1, the Better AF group support. You can go to alcoholfreelifestyle.com/betteraf. That is group virtual coaching to help you to stop drinking. The YouTube channel at alcoholfreelifestyle.com/YouTube. The book, Alcohol Freedom Formula, can be found at alcoholfreelifestyle.com/guide. My liver cleanse from my supplements company, Swan Vitality, at swanvitality.com. And protect your eyes from screens by wearing a pair of Swannies blue light blocking glasses from my sleep company, Swanic Sleep. You can find that at swannies.com. Catch you on the next one.